Welcome to Inside American Politics by Skoob. I'm your host, Bradley Teller, and today we're diving deep into one of the most peculiar features of American democracy, the government shutdown. It's a phenomenon that seems almost absurd when you think about it. The most powerful nation on earth, periodically shutting itself down because politicians can't agree on a budget. But these aren't just bureaucratic hiccups. They're dramatic showdowns that reveal the very soul of American politics. Let's start with the basics, because honestly, the whole concept is pretty wild when you break it down. A U.S. government shutdown happens when Congress fails to pass sufficient funding legislation to keep federal operations running. Think of it like this. Imagine if your household budget negotiations got so heated that you decided to turn off all the electricity, stop buying groceries, and send half the family to stay at a hotel until someone caves. That's essentially what happens to the federal government. The American Constitution gives Congress the power to allocate public funds, while the president signs budget laws into effect. When these two branches can't agree on how money should be spent, usually because of deeper political or ideological divisions, the flow of federal funding just stops. And when that happens, what the government calls non-essential functions freeze up immediately. Hundreds of thousands of employees either get furloughed or work without getting paid. But here's the thing that really gets me. Shutdowns expose both the procedural fragility and the political tensions that run through the entire U.S. budgetary process, like fault lines in an earthquake zone. Now, you might wonder, has it always been this way? Did the Founding Fathers sit around thinking, you know what would be fun? Let's build in a feature where the government can just stop working. Well, not exactly. The roots of the modern shutdown actually trace back to 1974, with something called the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act. This law restructured how Congress manages spending and curbed the president's ability to unilaterally withhold funds. Before this, budget disputes rarely caused the government to just shut down. Agencies operated under assumptions of continuity. They figured the money would eventually come. But then came 1980, and Attorney General Benjamin Civiletti issued a ruling that changed everything. He clarified that federal agencies could not legally incur obligations without appropriated funds. Suddenly, the concept of a shutdown took its modern form. Since then, when funding lapses, agencies must halt most activities until Congress passes new appropriations or something called a continuing resolution. Basically a temporary fix that kicks the can down the road. The impact of a shutdown ripples through nearly every aspect of American life, and it's not pretty. Sure, essential services continue, national security, air traffic control, emergency medical care, but with skeleton crews. Meanwhile, the rest of government basically closes up shop. National parks shut down, turning America's natural treasures into inaccessible wastelands. Passport offices grind to a halt, stranding would-be travelers. Research projects funded by government grants pause indefinitely, sometimes losing years of work. It's like watching a complex machine slowly seize up, one gear at a time. But the human effects, those are the real gut punch. Federal workers miss paychecks, trying to explain to their kids why they can't afford groceries even though mom and dad are still going to work every day. Contractors lose income with no guarantee they'll ever get it back. The cascading uncertainty dampens consumer spending and shakes investor confidence. And here's the kicker. The longer a shutdown drags on, the more it costs. Often the government ends up spending more on recovery and back pay than whatever the original budget dispute was even about. It's like burning down your house to win an argument about the thermostat setting. At its core, a government shutdown isn't really a procedural failure. It's a political weapon. These standoffs usually arise from partisan battles over policy priorities buried in budget legislation. We're talking about healthcare, immigration, defense spending, social welfare programs, the big-ticket items that define what kind of country America wants to be. Lawmakers sometimes use the threat of shutdown to gain leverage on contentious issues, gambling that the other side will get blamed for the resulting chaos. It's political chicken played with the world's largest economy as the stakes. These high-stakes confrontations have become emblematic of America's polarized political climate. where negotiations over fiscal policy frequently double as ideological battlegrounds. It's not just about dollars and cents, it's about competing visions of America itself. Despite their recurring nature, shutdowns have never become routine. Each episode carries its own political narrative and public fallout, its own heroes and villains, its own lessons about the limits of political brinkmanship. Let me take you back to 1995, when Newt Gingrich and his Republican revolutionaries thought they could fundamentally transform American government. The newly elected Republican majorities had swept into power, promising to both reduce taxes and balance the budget by shrinking government. Their weapon of choice? The reconciliation budget process. But there was a problem with their math. The tax cuts they wanted would reduce federal revenue, meaning they'd have to make massive cuts to popular entitlement programs. Social Security was declared off-limits early on. Even revolutionary Republicans weren't crazy enough to touch the third rail of American politics. So they set their sights on Medicare and Medicaid instead, proposing to cut these programs just as President Clinton and congressional Democrats were pushing for increases. The Republican budget included a staggering $894 billion in cuts to projected federal spending by 2002, with Medicare taking a $270 billion hit and Medicaid losing $163 billion. President Clinton drew a line in the sand, promising to veto any bill that requires crippling cuts in Medicare, weakens the environment, reduces educational opportunity, or raises taxes on working families. And he meant it. The timeline worked against Republicans. When they couldn't get their reconciliation bill to the president by the start of the fiscal year, they thought they had found leverage, force Clinton to choose between vetoing their bill and shutting down the government. But Clinton called their bluff. On November 13, 1995, he vetoed their measures. The next day, more than 800,000 non-essential federal employees were sent home, and the political theater began in earnest. Speaker Gingrich blamed the president for the shutdown. Clinton said he wouldn't sign their bill even if it took 90 days, 120 days, or 180 days. The public quickly grew tired of the spectacle, and negative reaction mounted against the Republicans who seemed to be holding the government hostage. Fast forward to 2013, and we find ourselves in a different kind of political moment. The Tea Party movement had injected new energy and new rigidity into Republican politics. Their target wasn't just spending, it was Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act that had become a symbol of everything they opposed about government overreach. By early 2013, the fiscal situation was already precarious. The automatic sequester cuts had kicked in, hitting budgets for the military, FEMA, the FBI, the FDA, and the SEC. America's apparatus of government was going into hibernation, just as the economic recovery was struggling to gain momentum. The different branches of government might as well have been speaking different languages. The House Republicans called for $4.6 trillion in cuts over 10 years, achieved entirely through spending reductions. The Senate and White House were proposing much smaller deficit reductions of $1.8 to $1.9 trillion, balanced between spending cuts and tax increases. As summer turned to fall, the Treasury announced it would run out of cash on October 17, 2013. The stage was set for a collision between fiscal crisis and ideological warfare. House Speaker John Boehner found himself caught between conventional Republican governance and Tea Party insurgency. When he tried to propose paying bondholders first in case of default, what seemed like sensible crisis management, Democrats dubbed it the Pay China First Act, pointing out that foreign creditors would get paid while American military personnel and Social Security recipients might not. The drama intensified when Senator Ted Cruz decided to make his stand. In a theatrical 21-hour speech opposing Obamacare, he promoted a hashtag, #MakeDC and even read "green eggs and ham" to his daughters watching at home. It was political performance art meets bedtime story, but Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid wasn't impressed by Cruz's marathon or moved by the House's anti-Obamacare demands. When the House passed a bill defunding the health care law, Reid stripped out that language and sent back a clean funding bill. What followed was like watching a speeding car negotiate with a brick wall, as one observer put it. The House kept making concessions, first defunding Obamacare entirely, then delaying implementation by 1 year, then keeping everything but stripping healthcare subsidies for federal politicians and staff. Each time, Harry Reid refused to flinch. When the clock struck midnight on October 1st, the optics were jarring. Republicans scurried around the Capitol sporting mischievous grins, while Democrats marched like they were in a funeral procession. These images spoke to a national divide. The vast majority of Americans blamed Republicans for the shutdown, but many GOP lawmakers didn't care. They weren't elected by the vast majority of the country. They represented safely red districts that rewarded last-ditch efforts to defeat Obamacare. Congressman David Schweikert from Arizona captured this perfectly. Just after midnight, he told reporters about a telephone town hall with his constituents. Nearly all of them supported the shutdown and blamed Senate Democrats for refusing to negotiate. "They get it," he said, practically squealing with delight. But did the Republicans get it? As Congressman Marlin Stutzman inadvertently admitted to the Washington Examiner in those early morning hours, "We have to get something out of this. And I don't know what that even is." That quote from Stutzman reveals something profound about modern Republican politics. The word fight had become the defining characteristic of the party. As economic and cultural changes left many voters feeling abandoned, they began to crave one quality above all others in their elected officials: a willingness to scrap, claw, kick, and bite on their behalf. This helps explain so much of what came later: why Donald Trump, despite innumerable flaws, won the presidency in 2016. Why Ted Cruz, despite obvious political defects, was the Republican runner-up. The fight itself had become more important than what they were fighting for. The 2013 shutdown lasted 16 days and achieved absolutely nothing for Republicans. They didn't defund or delay Obamacare. They didn't extract meaningful concessions on spending. They damaged their brand and proved that shutdowns were ineffective tools for advancing policy goals. But in a deeper sense, the shutdown succeeded brilliantly. It demonstrated that Republican leaders were willing to bring the government to a standstill rather than accept Democratic priorities. For voters who felt powerless against cultural and economic forces beyond their control, this kind of dramatic gesture was exactly what they wanted to see. Which brings us to December 2018, and the most surreal shutdown of all. As the 115th Congress neared its conclusion, President Trump was facing a familiar problem. He'd promised his supporters a border wall, but 2 years of Republican control of Congress hadn't delivered it. The final days played out with a mixture of chaos, political posturing, and behind-the-scenes drama. Trump had begrudgingly signed an earlier spending bill after being promised that wall funding would come by the end of the year. When it didn't happen, he took to Twitter. "We foolishly fight for border security for other countries, but not for our beloved USA. Not good." A few hours later, Trump convened a small group at the White House: Speaker Paul Ryan, Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy, and conservative firebrands Jim Jordan and Mark Meadows. It was a fitting conclusion to 2 years of tug-of-war for Trump's political soul, with establishment Republicans on one side and Freedom Caucus insurgents on the other. There was little suspense about the outcome. Trump wanted a vote on $5 billion for border wall funding. He believed passing it in the House would somehow force Democrats to negotiate, despite having no realistic path to success in the Senate. Shahira Knight, the Legislative Affairs Director, spoke up. "This is absolutely crazy. It's never going to work." But the train had already left the station. There was poetic irony in the moment. Some of the same conservative agitators who had pushed John Boehner into the 2013 shutdown were once again steering the government toward the edge. Meanwhile, down in Florida, Boehner himself was sipping drinks and laughing at the legislative terrorists he'd once deemed unfit for office, now running the show in Washington. The House hastily passed Trump's bill, padding it with disaster relief funds to attract reluctant votes. It passed 217 to 185, but by then many senators had already left for the holidays. The bill had no chance. It lacked support from all 51 Republican senators, let alone the 9 Democratic votes needed to overcome a filibuster. Trump made a last-ditch effort, calling GOP senators to pitch his strategy of pressuring red state Democrats. But it was pure fantasy. Worse, Trump had already publicly declared in a bizarre Oval Office meeting with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer that he would own the shutdown. By midnight on December 22nd, two things were clear. First, like the 2013 shutdown over Obamacare, this one was entirely futile. It had no realistic chance of delivering the policy outcomes its architects envisioned. Second, it was going to last much longer than anyone expected. With Democrats set to take control of the House on January 3rd, their leverage would only increase. Lawmakers were told to remain on standby in case of a breakthrough. Most scoffed and rushed to airports to make it home for the holidays. The only one left behind in Washington was Trump himself. Advised that leaving for Mar-a-Lago while federal employees were furloughed would look terrible, he remained in the White House, spending his days watching Fox News and calling friends, asking the same question over and over. When do you think the Democrats will cave? The shutdown dragged into 2019, becoming more than just a fiscal impasse. It was now a symbolic fight over Republican Party identity. In a high-stakes meeting with Democratic leaders, Trump escalated his threat. He would keep the government closed indefinitely, for months, maybe years, until he got wall funding. He even floated declaring a national emergency to secure the money unilaterally. The idea was widely viewed as absurd and dangerous. A national emergency is meant for actual emergencies, urgent situations that can't be addressed through normal means. For 2 years, Republicans had controlled both chambers of Congress. If border security was truly a priority, they'd had countless opportunities to fund it. But they hadn't. Even more troubling was what the proposal revealed about conservative principles. Freedom Caucus Chairman Mark Meadows tweeted support for using asset forfeiture money or declaring a national emergency. If they won't compromise, POTUS should use asset forfeiture money or other discretionary fees to start construction. Here was the leader of the small government pro-liberty wing of the GOP encouraging the president to confiscate private property to build a wall. The contradiction was staggering. Throughout the crisis, Trump never consulted the person who might actually know something about border security, Congressman Will Hurd of Texas. Hurd represented the largest border district in the country and was a former CIA officer who understood the border better than anyone in Congress. But the call from the White House never came. Hurd had left the CIA partly out of frustration with the caliber of people being elected to Congress. His departure stunned national security leaders. Robert Gates issued the first political endorsement of his life when Hurd ran for office. Yet here was Hurd, watching from the sidelines while Trump shut down the government over border policy without bothering to seek expert advice. By January 23rd, Hurd's frustration was palpable. We had 2,500 furloughed workers at a food bank in San Antonio last week. I just served some more of them at a soup kitchen in D.C. Here, at the seat of power in the free world, we're forcing federal employees to eat at soup kitchens, while China just launched a mission to the dark side of the moon. The shutdown stretched on for 35 days, the longest in U.S. history. Federal employees worked without pay, airport security was compromised, IRS operations were disrupted, national parks became dumping grounds, and scientific research ground to a halt. All sacrificed for a wall that still hadn't been built. When the government finally reopened, the damage was extensive. Trump's approval ratings dipped not just among independents, but within his own party. Republican lawmakers who had kept quiet during the crisis began speaking more freely in off-the-record conversations about a White House driven by impulse and a growing sense that the president was more interested in headlines than governance. The shutdown exposed the cost of Trump's dominance over the Republican Party. It wasn't just that he had led them into a dead end, it was that few had dared to stop him. McConnell had gone ghost for most of the shutdown. McCarthy offered little more than hollow support. The Freedom Caucus cheered from the sidelines, and when Trump finally caved, there was no acknowledgement of error, no recalibration. Instead, he pivoted immediately to threatening a national emergency if Congress didn't meet his demands by February 15th. By spring, the wall remained what it had always been, a symbol, not of security, but of division. Not of strength, but of spectacle. Construction hadn't begun, Congress refused to fund it, Mexico hadn't paid for it, and even the modest barriers that were approved would take years to build. But for Trump, the wall had served its purpose. It wasn't really a policy, it was a posture. It didn't need to exist, it just needed to be fought over. The battle itself was the point. The 35-day shutdown left lasting scars. It demonstrated how little the guardrails of American democracy could withstand when the people charged with upholding them were unwilling to act. Institutional norms were eroding not because of a single president, but because of a party that had surrendered its principles to remain in power. For many in the GOP, the lesson was painfully clear. So long as they remained tethered to Trump, governance would always take a back seat to grievance. The shutdown culture had infected the entire system. So what do decades of shutdowns really tell us? That in America's grand experiment with democracy, the biggest threat isn't collapse from outside, it's paralysis from within. Each shutdown is a political performance, a ritual of defiance dressed as principle. No one truly wins. The government reopens not through victory, but through exhaustion. But what if these shutdowns aren't failures at all, but a mirror showing who we've become? In a nation where compromise feels like betrayal, maybe the shutdown isn't a bug in the system, maybe it is the system. Want to know what really happens behind closed doors when Washington stops working? Download the Skoob app now to uncover the full story. And hear what they don't want you to know.